Hello and welcome to this Syncplicity admin training where we're going to tell you in this episode how you can add users into your account. So for today, we're going to show you how you can add users manually to your account, which is okay if you have a small deployment or you are doing an evaluation in Syncplicity. But we're also going to show you how users can get their account themselves, which means you don't need to manually provision them. They will actually sign up for an account themselves. How you can do the user management in an automated way. And we also give you some best practices on when you should add users manually or in an automated way. We also help you to update users, update the information like an email address or add additional email addresses, or impersonate users when you need to assist them. And this episode, of course, could not be complete without telling you how to manage users when, for example, a user leaves the organization. It's not just deleting or disable the account, but also make sure that the information that they own will be redirected or transferred to another user who will follow up. Okay, let's get started with this. So first we're going to start by adding users manually to your account, which is actually this typical process. An admin will add the email address of the user. You can add up to 250 users per batch. Each user will get an activation email, and that is for them required to activate their user account. That will open a web page where they also need to choose a password. And this also a little bit reveals the weakness of or where the manual activation is done. It's usually done when users or customers do not use single sign-on, or that could be, for example, typically in an evaluation where single sign-on is not available yet. And from that moment, users can log in and use the platform, and we're going to show today how they can access the files. And in a later episode, we're also going to show you how they can install the desktop client or synchronize files. Adding users manually is done by adding the email addresses. So in order to add users, I have logged into the Syncplicity admin console. I am logged in with the role Global Administrator, and under admin, you'll see a tab called User Accounts. Here you see any users that are already added to the account. In order to add new users, simply click the button Add a User, and here you can add up to 250 users in one batch. Separated by a comma, I'm going to add 3 users to my account. User 1, User 2, and User 3. You can also give them a specific role. And for this case, because I just want them to be added as normal users, I will select the user role. The second step allows you to specify the groups that these users should be member of. And our best practice is to always add users to a certain group. And in this case, the group already existed, so I'm adding them to the apprentices group. Next, I can also specify which folders should be automatically added by the desktop client to Syncplicity. So in this case, the desktop and the documents folder are going to be added to Syncplicity. That's it. So I have added now 3 users to my account, and they can start using Syncplicity. They will get an activation email. We call that the welcome email. And in that email, there is a link for them to activate their user account. Let's go back and navigate to the users that I added. And you see here, if I search, for example, for user 1, the user is created, is never logged in, and also the username, first name and last name have not been filled in. The user will receive an email with an activation link. Clicking on that link will ask the user to enter first name, last name, choose a password, agree with the terms and conditions, and the account is activated. This additional step can sound a little bit confusing for some users because they receive an email to activate their account. This step can of course also be skipped when an organization enables single sign-on. That activation email is required for Syncplicity to enable the users to choose a password and not having an administrator choose that password. It also requires the end user to enter his first name, last name. Once you implement and enable single sign-on, then this activation step, this welcome email, can be skipped because The password does not need to be stored in Syncplicity. The password will now be stored in your Active Directory. The users will now authenticate to your Active Directory, and also the first name and last name are already stored in your Active Directory, so there's no need anymore for a user to enter this information in Syncplicity. We can automatically obtain that the first time that a user logs in. So let's look at that activation email. The welcome email is received by user 1 and it contains the button to log in to activate the account. Clicking on the link opens a page where the user enters his first name, his last name, choose a password that contains at least 8 characters, uppercase and lowercase, and a number or symbol. The user also needs to check the box to agree with the terms and condition, and from that moment the account is activated. So the user is now active. What's next? The user can either use the browser-based user interface, or the user can work with a Syncplicity client, something that you install in your desktop, Windows or Mac, or something that you run as an app on your mobile device. From the browser-based user interface, you can easily create folders. You can navigate through folders and upload and download files from the browser. And once a file is uploaded, you can also share the files as a link. You can specify with whom you want to share the link, or you can decide to share the entire folder. Simply right mouse click on the folder, share, and specify with whom you want to share the folder and what rights that the other participants should have on the folder. Optionally, you can also author, edit, or create documents from the browser using our Office 365 integration. Simply click on the file, have it open in Office 365 and author it. But in order to make your life easier, you can also decide to download the desktop client for Mac or Windows. And if you have admin rights on your computer, you can install it yourself, or you can ask an administrator to push this through a GPO. If you have not enabled single sign-on, then log in with your email address and password. You specify a name for your computer, and optionally, you can decide which folders on your computer you would like to protect. After a short wizard that gives you an intro into Syncplicity, you are ready to go. And you see that the first folders on your computer are already syncing. That means, in this case, the documents folder is already synced. So, when you create a new document in a Syncplicity folder, like the documents folder here, for example a Word document, then at that moment that file will automatically be synced. If you modify the file and you save your changes, that version of the file will also be synchronized. And a backup is always in your Syncplicity account. Let's look at this a little bit closer. When the user is in the Syncplicity browser interface, under Install, he can download the desktop client, open it, agree with the terms and conditions, and then the Syncplicity desktop client will be installed. You log in with your credentials. If SSO is not enabled, deactivate corporate login and log in with your email address and password. Then you will be asked for a computer name, and you can also optionally select which folders you'd like to synchronize. After a small tutorial, the desktop client will automatically start syncing your files. And at that moment, you can continue working. The desktop client will sync all the files nicely in the background. As an administrator, you can explain to users that any documents that they create in a Syncplicity folder will automatically be synced. So when a user creates a document, like here in the example, creating a Word document, saving the file will automatically initiate the sync. The end user does not need to do anything to get the file synced. If users rather would like to use a browser as an interface, here they can also create folders. They can add files by drag and drop, use the file uploader, or create new documents from the browser. Besides uploading files, users can also share files using shared links. Right mouse click on the file, generate shared link, and you can immediately email the link with the email address of the recipient of the file. Users can also decide to share an entire folder if they want to collaborate on a certain project, for example. They just select the folder, right mouse click, share, and they enter the email address of the participants in that folder and also provide the rights that these participants should have on the folder. Users can also add and alter files from the browser. They can, for example, open a document, in this case a Word document, from the browser. It will open with Microsoft Word Online, thanks to my Office 365 subscription. And I, as a user, I can modify the file here from the browser. There's no need for me to install any software. Everything will be done from the browser. And finally, when you see that this user has modified the file, you can also see the versions that were created. Adding users manually is not our best practice, and sometimes it could happen that you cannot add a user because the user is already linked to a different account. And you ask yourself, what went wrong? Well, actually nothing really went wrong, but the problem is that the user that you're trying to add already exists, not in your account, but outside your account. And you ask yourself, how was this possible? You see here the example. I've got user 1, user 2, and user 3 in my company. And what actually happened is that one of the users has shared a folder or a secure shared file with a different user, and that caused the system to generate a free personal edition account outside your company for that user. Now you can ask yourself, what is wrong with that? Well, very simple. In your account, you have security policies set up, but for this user who is outside of your organization, those policies that you've created do not apply. Now, how can you solve this? Well, you can ask the user to close their personal edition account, or if it was by some reason linked to a different tenant, you can open a support ticket and have that resolved. But the best practice is immediately from the beginning, blacklist your domain. That is what you see here in the tip. When users are trying to get a personal edition account with your corporate email domain, they will get a notification that they can't and that they need to contact an administrator. If, for example, here user 2 tries to share something with user 4, then user 2 will get a notification that user 4 does not have an account yet and needs to request an account before user 2 can share a folder with him. Adding users manually to your account is okay for small deployments and maybe even for a proof of concept, but usually in real world, admins would like to have a more automated way to add users to the account. One of those first steps is end user self sign up. It actually means that end users are going to create an account the moment that they click on a URL. The advantage of that is that the administrator does not need to add each user individually, and users can decide on their own if they want an account or not. The administrator will configure single sign-on, which is the prerequisite for end-user self-sign-up. Via a wizard, the admin will create a URL. That wizard contains a few steps where the admin whitelists certain domains to be allowed to use end-user self-sign-up. The admin selects the group to which users are going to be automatically added. The admin can optionally also assign acceptable use policy and can also enter a welcome text for users once their account is active. That URL is then distributed to the potential user community. These users will click on the URL, to which they will be redirected to the single sign-on for authentication. At that moment, after successful authentication, their user account is automatically activated and users are automatically added to the correct group. From that moment, the user is onboarded and we have the same scenario as with the manual provisioning. The user can use the browser client or use the desktop client. As a pre-requirement, we already mentioned this, single sign-on must be ready, so your identity provider must be configured correctly. And also it is a best practice to have your groups and security policies already configured in Syncplicity. So once the users are added to the group, that also the correct security policy is going to be applied to them. End user self sign up can be done by a global administrator under settings and then end user self sign up. The feature can be turned on and the administrator will define one or more email address domains. from which end users can sign up. The administrator will define an acceptable use policy, select one or more groups to which the users are going to be added when they sign up, and you optionally can also enter a custom text that will be included in the last part of the activation email that will be sent to them as part of the sign-up process. For example, welcome to Syncplicity. When that is done, and when you click Save, you will see that a URL is being generated. As an administrator, you can now distribute that URL. Users who click on the URL will authenticate to your identity provider, and they will get a notification that a message has been sent to them to verify the email address. Clicking on that link will require me to still enter my first name and last name if these fields cannot be retrieved from the SSO. I also need to agree with the acceptable use policy, click submit, and at that moment my account is active and I am now part of the organization. And the next steps are as equal as with manual user provisioning. Users can download the desktop client or they can use the browser interface to interact with Syncplicity. So as a summary, after the administrator configures single sign-on, the administrator can create a URL for the end users to self-sign up. He distributes that URL to the end users. When they click on the URL, they will authenticate to the single sign-on provider, the IDP. That means the user is at that moment authenticated. They will get an email to verify the email address they used to sign up. And if they click on that URL in that email, at that moment their account is activated and also added to the correct groups. For the rest, the end users can use from that moment the browser client or install the desktop client to work with Syncplicity. We also have the ability to do automated user provisioning, which means that an automated process will provision and deprovision the users, and your Active Directory will now become the single source of user identities. The users are automatically provisioned in Syncplicity when they are added to the Active Directory or when they are in the correct groups. But they will also, and this is very important, automatically be deprovisioned when they leave the organization. And not only that, your passwords will also not leave the organization. In contrary to, for example, Azure, where you would sync your passwords between your Active Directory on-premise and an Active Directory in Microsoft's data center, Syncplicity users will authenticate to your Active Directory in your account. And how does that work? Well, it's very simple. Using solutions like Okta or OneLogin as a cloud solution, users will automatically be provisioned when they are added to the Active Directory and also deprovisioned, of course. You can also choose for a solution like Ping Federate, where the solution, the sync tool, is actually in your own data center. And if you'd like to not consider any third-party solutions, we also have our own AD-Sync appliance tool, which would do the trick for you. The benefit is that the AD-Sync tool runs on-premise in your own data center, does not need to be required to run in a cloud, and you have full control over that appliance. This overview would not be complete if we would not show you the way to provision users using the API. And using the API, you can provision users, similar like you would do that manually, by providing an email address, first name, last name, and optionally also select the account type or the role that they should have. And using the API, you see that here on our developer portal, I can try out the API and you see that I got a response to 100. And if I now would look in the admin user interface of Syncplicity, you would see that the user is created. So as a result, you can also provision users using the API. So no matter if you provision the users manually or automated or via API, there are several scenarios when to use what. In a proof of concept or a small deployment, you would like to start with an administrator who provisions the user accounts in Syncplicity, and he would do that manually. But that is not the recommended approach for production. In a small deployment or proof of concept, the desktop client will be probably installed by the user themselves if they have local admin rights. What we usually see as part of your proof of concept or as part of your pilot is that single sign-on is being set up, and that is actually our foundation of end user self sign up, which is a lot used in a pilot or a proof of concept. But later, and that is also our best practice for deployments, is to deploy an AD-Sync tool, our Syncplicity AD-Sync tool, or use a third-party solution like Okta OneLogin or Ping Federate to provision and deprovision your users. So you go very easily from manual provisioning via end-user self-sign-up, which is an optional step, to perform AD-Sync. And we also see as part of a production deployment or part of the pilot that at some stage you would also deploy the desktop client via a GPO instead of doing that installation manually. So with that, we have given you an overview of what to use when, and also give you several steps to provision users from manual provisioning, end user self sign up, API or AD-Sync tool. Next on our agenda is the option to update or impersonate your users. For example, a user complains about an issue in Syncplicity that they can't find a folder or can't restore a file. Then at that moment, you might say, hey, I'm going to jump in, I'm going to look in the system as if I were the user and be able to find that folder or restore that file. Another use case is where a user has left the organization and you need to access a folder that that user owned, which was a private folder, which is of course no longer accessible if the user is disabled or maybe even deleted already. It could also be interesting if the user has left the organization but owned folders and you need to manage participants in that shared folder, or what we're going to see in the next chapter is change ownership of that folder. Very simple. As an administrator, you can go to user accounts in your admin console and then search for the user you'd like to update or impersonate. Navigate to the user. For example, this one is an active user and I want to impersonate the user. If you do this, notice the red bar. The user will get an email that an administrator has accessed the Syncplicity account. Being the administrator, I can navigate to a folder and, for example, manage the participants in that shared folder or perform any other actions on behalf of that user. Now, what is our best practice for user offboarding? The objective of this video is more concentrated on adding users, so we're going to summarize a little bit how the user offboarding works. But our best practice is that this is being performed by a global admin. It all starts by searching the user you'd like to offboard, and at that moment you can disable the account, which means that the user will lose access to Syncplicity from all his devices. Then you run a folder report, and that company folder report will give you an insight on which folders that this user owned. At that moment, you can say, for example, I've got a folder that was shared with other people and I need to transfer the ownership. You simply select the folder, change the owner to another user, and that's it. And at that moment, you could also decide to remove the old owner, the old user, from the list of participants of that shared folder. And this brings us, unfortunately, to the end of our session. We showed you today how you can add users in your account. We showed you how to do this manually, where you can make your life a little bit easier with the end user self sign up, ideal for proof of concepts, or automate this. We also give you some best practice in when you would start with manual and what moment you would do this automated. We also showed you how to add users via API. We also told you that you can update users at any time and showed you how to do impersonation if you really need to get access to that user's account. And of course, we gave you some best practice tips on how you offboard users, part of your deployment or in your proof of concept. With that, we'd like to point you to other material we have available. Starting your Syncplicity account, which is ideal if you're going to do a trial. How to set up your account, add users, that is this video, do group management and set up your security policies, rolling out the desktop clients or mobile clients to your end users, and configure the real hardcore stuff, what we usually call the on-prem storage vaults, implementing single sign-on and Active Directory Sync, Data Hub, and etc. etc. Please stay tuned for other material on Syncplicity in the admin section. Bye bye.